In part one of the Tellico Dam docuseries, we learned that the Tennessee Valley Authority, under Chairman Audrey Wedd Wagner, had decided to pursue the Tellico project. The year was 1967, and the TVA had already constructed a series of hydroelectric dams. Now they set their sights on the Little Tennessee River, beginning construction on the dam that would flood the area, creating Tellico Reservoir, soon to be a beautiful recreational lake with miles of shoreline for lakefront homes, manufacturing, and commercial endeavors. The TVA was convinced that the Tellico Dam would bring much-needed economic development to the area, especially for the severely economically depressed counties of Monroe, Loudoun, and Blount. However, the project was not without controversy, as more than 300 landowners would give up their farms through eminent domain. And many wondered if TVA could deliver all that had been promised to improve the quality of life for the citizens of the area. Let's pick up the story in the early 1970s as TVA pursued completion of the Tellico Dam. In 1973, the pristine waters of the Little Tennessee River were still flowing, but TVA was moving forward with its plan to build the Tellico Dam. Federal agents were systematically moving along the riverbanks, making offers to landowners to purchase their farms through eminent domain. This land was essential for TVA to fulfill their promise of a better life for the citizens of the area. While some farmers along the banks of the Little T sold willingly, others were searching for ways to keep their farms. They joined forces to beseech their elected officials to develop the river instead, lobbied to keep those acres of land that would not be flooded by the resulting reservoir, and were desperate to find any reason to halt construction of the dam. The landowners left no stone unturned in their quest for hope, and that hope would come from a most unlikely source. Hope for the farmers came in the form of a tiny fish.
It was rather late in the game. It was in 1974, and most of the families had been driven off the land. TVA was bulldozing the houses and the barns into holes in the ground and setting them on fire, and people got disenchanted. There were about 40 or 50 people still fighting, and they had fought the environmental impact statement case and ultimately lost it.
But that's when one of Zig's law students at the University of Tennessee came to him with an idea for an assignment. It was the first time Zig would hear about the Snail Darter, a little fish that would dominate his career for years to come and still does.
So when Hank Hill said, I want to do a term paper, they've discovered a little fish that's endangered in the middle of the Little Tennessee River, is that enough for 10 pages? I said, we've got to go talk to the local people who've been trying to stop this for so many years. So we went back to Fort Loudoun, where they used to have their potluck dinners. And we talked that there's a snail darter. If you read very carefully Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, it's not just procedure that they have to do paperwork. If an agency is going to destroy an endangered species or its habitat, it can't do it. Asa McCall was sitting there quiet in his coveralls, and he said, this is it? It comes down to a bitty fish? He said, a bitty fish? But I say, if it might save our farms, we got to try once more. And he took off his hat. It's at Maryville College now in the library as an artifact. He passed it around, and these weren't rich people, but that amount of money said, all right, we're going to try to bring a lawsuit against this gigantic federal agency.
So this really was the last straw or the last fish.
There was no other help.
So everything
else. There was no other hope. Under our system of law and government, when you've got the establishment, the Iron Triangle, cooking, the official projects, the official programs can't be stopped by ordinary people unless you find an accidental piece of law. The little fish was like a canary in the coal mine, though. Because it was endangered, you could bring law. People who were affected could bring law saying, this project needs scrutiny.
The little fish interrupted the process of completing the Tellico Dam. Those who opposed the dam had first tried the Cherokees, then the farmers, then alternative land development along the river. And now they turned to a little fish. Hill, Zig, and the other dam opponents filed a citizen suit against TVA in early 1976. They accused TVA of violating the Endangered Species Act because the completed project would jeopardize the continued existence of the species. While the district court found that Tellico Dam would inundate the Snail Darter's design critical habitat, it refused to halt completion of the dam.
The Sixth Circuit said the trial judge found all the facts of a violation of federal law by this federal agency. It must stop the project.
At this time, TVA sought review of the decision by the Supreme Court and continued construction work on the Tellico Dam until the district court formally issued an injunction. In part one, we met Charles Wagner, lead counsel for TVA in the early 1970s. It was during his tenure that the Snail Darter case was filed against TVA. Obviously, those who brought that court case were opposed to the construction of the dam or the reservoir. Do you think it was really the Snail Darter that they were protecting, or was it some bigger view of the dam itself?
Well, that's not just what I think, that's what they said. The Snail Darter was a pawn. The Snail Darter was a basis to stop a project. And I came with TVA in 1971, and you know, in 1966 is when the project was first approved.
Yep. Yep.
And it was started in 67, kind of toward midway in my years at TVA, after the project was 75–80% complete, the endangered species passes. Well, even when it passed, we weren't, I mean, it was not a big issue with TVA, but then the Snail Darter was discovered at Coy Springs, and there was a bunch of hoopla about that, and a process started to have it listed as being endangered or threatened or entitled to some protection.
The case was eventually taken to the Supreme Court after going through the local and appeals court.
It's kind of a lengthy process that got us to that point. You know, once the lawsuit was filed, and that was filed by a professor at the UT Law School, Zygmunt Fodder had some students, and they filed the lawsuit to stop that. At that point, the Snail Darter had been discovered. There were certainly lots of issues about, number one, was it really a separate identifiable species? Was it a subspecies? Was it entitled to protection? Does the mere fact that it had just been discovered necessarily make it endangered? Perhaps it existed in other places. This is the only point that it had been discovered. But the fact is, nobody knew whether it existed in other streams or not because it hadn't been looked for. There were lots of issues that went through the Department of the Interior. The Department of Interior made a determination that it was a separate species, and the Department of Interior took the position that you cannot alter the Snail Darter's native habitat. And by impounding the dam, that would alter the native habitat.
Mr. Wagner went on to explain that TVA took the position that even after discovery of the Snail Darter, Congress had continued to appropriate funds for the dam. The federal district court in Knoxville ruled that the Endangered Species Act was not absolute, and that construction of the dam, already more than 80% complete, could proceed.
On appeal, the Court of Appeals made a different determination. They said it is an absolute. You don't look at either of these, any of these mitigating factors. You just look at the fact that an endangered species will be altered and that their habitat, native habitat, will be damaged. The Supreme Court then decided 6-3, again in favor of the absolute protection.
Ultimately, the fate of the little t would be determined by what came after the Supreme Court ruling. The article titled The Endangered Species Act and Dam Construction by Guerrero, Crawford, Hayes, and Heindel reviews the court's decision and what happened next. They write, the Supreme Court had affirmed the Circuit Court's judgment, agreeing that the operation of the Tellico Dam would eradicate an endangered species. Although the Supreme Court affirmed the injunction against Tellico Dam, the justices did not agree with the cause, and the strongly worded opinion may have been an attempt to goad Congress into amending the ESA. The justices believed that Congress had been a jackass in writing the ESA and would amend the act following the court's decision. Chief Justice Warren Burger wrote that he intended to serve notice to Congress that it should take care of its own chestnuts. His strongly worded opinion makes it clear that the court did not agree with stopping the dam, but that Congress had left them with no choice but to affirm the decision.
After the Supreme Court ruling, Congress began to set the wheels in motion to override the ESA. Led by Tennessee Senator Howard Baker, they formed the Endangered Species Committee, often referred to as the God Squad or God Committee. Zeke explains why that didn't work out as they had expected.
The God Committee unanimously said, we've studied the economics now for 3 months. This dam has never made economic sense. They've spent 95% of the budget. And if you take the full project benefits against just that 5%, it is not justified. They should not develop the dam, they should develop the river, which is what we'd been shouting about. Howard Baker engineered an amendment attached to a multi-billion-dollar appropriations bill. It went into the law, and we tried and tried to break it out. And Howard Baker ultimately twisted enough arms to pass an override against the committee, the unanimous decision of the committee that he himself had created. Jimmy Carter said he was going to veto it, and then at the last minute, he said he's not going to veto it, and so the law was amended. The Tellico Dam was to be finished irrespective of the economics and irrespective of the Snail Darter.
That's a curious thing how that happens. If the Supreme Court ruled that they couldn't, but they put in an appropriations bill, how does, being a lawyer in this balance of power we have in our system, how does that work?
Now, well, the way it works is the Supreme Court said that the Congressional Act of the Endangered Species Act prevented the destruction of the habitat. Protecting an endangered species is not a constitutional issue. That was interpreting an act of Congress.
I got you.
Then the same body that created the legislation in the first place decided to exempt the Tellico project from that act. So under the balance of power, the Supreme Court was interpreting an act of Congress, and then the Congress changed that rule.
When did you learn that all of your efforts had failed, and what was your response?
And the phone rang, and it said, this is Air Force One. President Carter wants to speak to you. And I thought, he's vetoed the bill, and he's going to tell America that the environmental case is stronger than TVA's argument for this dam. Good ecology makes good economics. And Carter knew all of this. But he said, Professor Plotter, I've just signed the law overriding the protection for the Little Tennessee River. I thought I had to do it for the sake of environmental protection in the United States. Well, you asked me how I felt. I thought that was crazy.
What was Jimmy Carter's rationale for not vetoing this bill?
The story I was told the next morning from friends inside the White House was that Jimmy Carter had prepared a veto message. And Frank Moore, who was his congressional liaison, had come to him and said, Mr. President, I understand that you're about to veto that bill overriding the endangered species protection for the Little Tennessee River. And Carter turned to him and said, yes, I am. It's the right thing to do. And Moore said, Mr. President, if you veto that bill, tomorrow morning, every editorial cartoon in the country is going to have you holding a snail darter in one hand and a killer rabbit in the other. He'd been fishing and a rabbit apparently had been chased and was swimming and was trying to bite his fish. And so the media went crazy about killer rabbit. But Mr. President, you can't stand that kind of media. It looks ridiculous. That stupid little fish that's stopping a gigantic hydroelectric dam. He knew he could get his veto sustained and have a sense of power in Washington that he didn't have. But the threat of bad media? So I ask my students, what's the most important branch of government? Is it the executive? Is it the legislative? Is it the judicial? And whatever they say, I say, no. It's the media. It's how the public learns. Because if the public learns, then politicians will be forced to follow.
In part one, we met two landowners whose families lost their farms to eminent domain for the Tellico Dam. After the Supreme Court decision, they did not sit idly by while Congress contemplated amending the Endangered Species Act. In fact, they made several trips to Washington, D.C. to advocate for the farmers with their representatives in Congress.
One trip I really remember well, we were planning to go, and this man had died up here at Von Orr, who has lost his farm, and his wife called me and said her son would like to go, and he was a little fellow. He was about a sophomore, maybe in high school. We tried to see Howard Baker. He wouldn't see us. He was dead set, against us. And we went to this room. There was about a half a dozen of us, and here was a whole bunch of the camera people taking pictures as these senators walked in. So the little fella and I weaseled our way amongst them, and when we got right up to the rope, here stood a guard that was about 6'8" and 300 pounds, and he looked over at us and he said, "Are you two guys reporters?" And before I could speak, the little fella said, "We're farmers." He said, "Son, the farmer is the most important person in the world. He feeds us. What are y'all doing here?" So then I told him, "We're trying to see our Senator Howard Baker, but he won't see us." He said, "Right now he's right over our heads in an office, and he has only one way to get down here, and that's an elevator down that hallway. If you boys will go down that hallway, when the door opens, if he don't step out, step in with him and you've got him." So he went and got the others, and we raced down the hallway and just hadn't been there but a second, and the door opened, and it was Howard Baker. I had never been face to face with him, and he was about 5'2". And he was so glad to see us. He had heard we were in town. He was just tickled to death to see us. And he wanted to meet with us later. And he did, but of course, it didn't help us any.
Can you remember any specific situations of these trips where you found that you thought you'd made some headway, or was it just like beating your head against the wall?
Well, we were told a lot of untruths. For instance, one time, I think it was Sasser, Senator Sasser, told us we cornered him. Well, see, when you corner any of them, it's just like, oh, these people are from my district, and they're just all smiles, and they're all nice, and they're going to tell you anything. He even told us he would be an attorney for us to get our land back. Well, he was already in TVA's pocket, but that's what he tells us. So when we get back and nothing happens, then Mama writes all these letters to him of remember when. Well, of course, he conveniently forgot that. He's just not going to approach it. So we learned a lot about government and how it runs.
While some family farmers were still seeking to stop its construction, many others in the area were very much in favor of completion of the dam for the economic development that TVA had promised. One of the most vocal proponents of the dam was the mayor of Tellico Plains, Charles Hall. He has since passed, but his daughter Pamela maintains the extensive history Charles compiled regarding the saga of the Tellico Dam project.
In the Tellico Plains area, none of our teachers or people or students or Sunday school teachers ever talked about the Tellico Dam as being a bad thing. You know, we always looked for it with anticipation and that things would be nice and that there would also be recreation with it. We became aware of the Cherokee portion of it and the Cherokee towns, but to learn really more about the Cherokee in our area seemed to be a very positive.
How did it come to pass that your father played such a role? What led him to this?
I just remember, of course, I graduated high school in 71, and the dam wasn't finished until there was controversy of the Snail Darter came after I left high school, and I was at a University of Tennessee. But growing up, Dad's main focus was always employment for the people of Tellico Plains and for Monroe County. So his motive was jobs. Many people left for jobs and had for years. So it always felt very positive that maybe someday we wouldn't have to leave and we would have more jobs there and more opportunities. And so it was a lot about poverty and people not leaving the area. He knew a lot of the property owners, and there were many that were in big support of the Tellico Dam. But it seems like today that you do hear, there's kind of a movement of the ones who weren't against the dam. My dad was very much for what is good for the many rather than good for the few. We have to feel good about what we're sacrificing for others. And that was really who he was.
I actually called a friend of mine, Dave Harrell. Dave Harrell is a person that grew up in Madisonville and lived up here. And Dave reminded me that during the course of the Snail Darter case, that TVA held a public hearing up here. And part of the public hearing, the goal of the public hearing was to test community support and what the community felt about it. At that meeting, it was almost unanimously in favor of the project. The people wanted the project because it was going to bring prosperity or better prosperity to this area.
In the 60s is really when I began to really find out about it. I didn't think anything about it because I didn't think it ever happened. I think Dad said something about it, and he said it may take some of our land. And I was really tickled. I thought, Lord, we want to get rich. And the more I heard about it, I found out people wasn't getting rich. I knew that we needed jobs. And they were saying, the dam will bring jobs. But I didn't think at the time about all the land they were going to take. And I had friends and people was losing their homes, and I felt sorry for them. But jobs people was just starving. Now, we didn't starve because we had that farm, but it was hard the land had got so bad that there's gullies in it. It was awful. I'd play in them, and you couldn't even see out of them, and you didn't have the money to get fertilized, and but the New Deal helped all that.
It seems to me from reading the newspapers and talking to folks that most people in Monroe County seem to support the dam. Is that true?
Well, I don't think so. But I wasn't out asking people, you know. But around, I live too close to Von Orr. And people in Von Orr, you know, very few. It was hard to find anyone that's wanted the dam. But a lot of people on the river that had these big farms, by then, the first dam had damaged the soil so bad, and they was having to fertilize and everything. But it used to be that they didn't have to use fertilizer or anything. But then they had to irrigate the land and stuff, and it was harder to. I know my great grandfather, Thomas White, had some land that he had purchased up on the river, and when it flooded, he didn't want it anymore.
You felt that people around Von Orr were probably against the dam.
I know they were.
What about the people in Madisonville or Tellico?
They were excited about it because they knew that people needed jobs, and we did. We did. There's a lot of people for it that wanted to sell. Yes, Dan Hicks and Charles Hall they wanted it. And I did too, but I had mixed feelings, you know.
In the end, the Tellico Dam prevailed. Zig told us earlier that President Jimmy Carter did not veto the Congressional amendment to the Endangered Species Act, which allowed the dam to be completed. Carolyn Ritchie shares what happened when the farmers heard the news.
Daddy was a veteran of World War II. It was on Veterans Day, November the 11th on a Sunday, 1979, when we're told that's it. Carter doesn't veto on the 25th. Alfred rallies us all together, and we have a tractorcade down Gay Street. We made poster boards, signs that put in the tractors, and Daddy had a 2-cylinder John Deere tractor. Have you ever heard one of those? It's like the pop, 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 pop. Well, you ought to hear that going down Gay Street as it echoes back and forth. It just made the chills go up your back. And then to see your parents' faces, oh, it was an emotional time.
So had all of you already lost your land at this point? Were you already off the land?
Oh, heavens to Betsy, no. We were still living there. So by the December, they slap a federal condemnation paper and tell us we have to be out by the end of the year. Well, my mom and Daddy said, well, we're not going anywhere. There's nowhere to go. So that Christmas came, went, there we were, still there. So we had to file a suit to go through federal court, and it was Judge Robert Taylor in Knoxville. He would not let you have a trial by jury. He had the option, but he wouldn't let you have it.
So you were just,
You were
at
your
that
own-
point you were trying to raise the price they were giving you.
It was our avenue to fight at that time.
Oh, I got you.
That's what was thrown at us, so our next play was, well, okay, we're gonna have to fight it this way.
What do you think you could have done differently to have changed the outcome?
I'd fight harder. I don't know just what I would do differently, but I would fight harder. I wouldn't have to lay awake wondering if I was going to fight.
We do not feel like we left any stone unturned. We can rest assured that we did everything within our power, and even though the lake is here and the river is gone and our land has got houses and brush piles on it, we have no regrets because we did, and we were right. So we even though it didn't happen our way, we know in our hearts that we were right.
You did the right thing.
Yeah.
Gary, you were asking earlier about the things that have been written and generally being negative. One that I have focused in on is Zig Plotter's book. I get a signed book from him and I get a note that the note says, well, I'm assuming from the fact that you have asked me for a copy of my book, that you have a change of heart on this and that you now recognize that the dam should not have been constructed. So I sent him a letter and I said, you know, Zig, I appreciate you signing the book and so forth, but my takeaway is totally different from yours. My takeaway is that the Tellico project has proved that a species is not necessarily endangered just because it's just been discovered. As we all know, the Snail Darter has been found in other areas. It has not only survived, but has thrived in the areas where TVA transplanted it. And it's just not endangered. And it wasn't entitled to the protection in the first place. And the act was misused to achieve a result that was not appropriate.
And did you hear from Mr. Platt
No,
after that?
never heard back from him.
It was stupid little fish being defended by environmental extremists is blocking a gigantic hydroelectric dam. So, as you can see, even people who were environmentalists were a little embarrassed that this was a stupid environmental case. They never realized that this was a case defending farmers' private property, agricultural history, tourism, and common sense in economic terms.
The citizens' lawsuit was never really about the Snail Darter or the Endangered Species Act. It was simply the last hope of the farmers to stop the construction of the dam to save their land from eminent domain. Even so, the Supreme Court ruled in their favor and the Tellico Dam seemed doomed. It took an act of Congress to revive the project. The Endangered Species Act was amended. The dam was slated for completion and the Snail Darter lives on. Tune in next time to explore the final stages of the journey, the events leading up to when the dam was closed and the water began to rise. Only time would tell if the results of the Tellico Dam would live up to all that TVA had planned and promised.